G'day everyone, and thank you Neil for including me in the lineup for this amazing summit. I love the theme, the awakening of humanity, and it relates very much to my own experience in my recent years of journeying as a Paleocontact guide. Now the word Paleocontact refers to the theory that our ancestors had contact with other civilizations, extraterrestrial civilizations in the deep past. And this is what I write about in my books, the Eden series, and it's what I talk about on my YouTube channels, the Paul Wallis channel and The Fifth Kind. I'm going to start by talking about a person who I was forced to re-engage with as I made the journey from the genteel world of Christian ministry into the world of Paleocontact. Now, my background is in church ministry, 33 years working as a church doctor, a theological educator, and an archdeacon for the Anglican Church in Australia. That's one down from a bishop. And it's unusual for a senior church person to step forwards and say, wait a minute guys, I think actually a lot of what we have in the Bible is the report of our ancestors about Paleocontact. And a key figure in learning to reframe and re-understand the ancient stories in that light is Plato. Plato is widely recognized as one of the greatest thinkers in world history, and his work was really foundational to much of the thought that generated the Gospels and New Testament and the writings of the early Christians. The Apostle Paul would often be quoted alongside Plato by the early church fathers, and when they quoted Paul against Plato, they really felt they were paying Paul a compliment. That was how highly Plato was esteemed. The British mathematical philosopher Alfred North Whitehead famously described the whole of the Western tradition of philosophy as no more than a series of footnotes to Plato. And Plato had the most vivid way of talking about the awakening experience that we've been exploring in these last couple of days. He describes the awakening experience in his book, The Republic, and it's in that most famous passage that refers to the cave. And so the scenario is this. Plato describes that the great majority of human beings are living in a condition that is analogous to people sitting in a cave, living their whole lives out in this cave, not knowing life outside of this cave. And the only reality they are aware of is what they can see directly in front of them, because they are in chains and they are controlled so that they can't move their heads from side to side and even see each other as they really are. All they can see is their shadows on the wall in front of them. There's a fire behind them projecting their shadows onto the cave wall. So everything that they see is really the shadow of the reality. And the only reality they're seeing projected is the reality inside the cave. So Plato then asks us to do a little thought experiment. What would happen, he says, if someone were to break free from these chains, get up and walk out of that cave into the daylight? Now, at first he said, it would be very painful. Going from darkness into daylight, it would be painful. You would resist it, you'd close your eyes, you'd look away. But then after a while, you would become habituated to the daylight, at first by looking just at the reflections of things, perhaps in water, and then you'd be able to look at things as they really are. And suddenly you'd realize the world is very different to what you thought it was. You begin encountering realities you'd never encountered before. You can see the sun, the moon, and the stars, clouds, plants, animals. And as you wake up to this new reality, you realize how limited and dark and painful that existence in the cave really had been. And as you turn back and look into the cave, and realize that all your peers, all your friends and family, all the peoples of every country are living in that cave thinking that is the real world, you would surely be overwhelmed with pity and compassion. And Plato said, of course, you will feel compelled to go back in because you want to rescue the people who are in chains, seeing only shadows. You will want them to see the things you're seeing and experience the freedom that you're now enjoying. And so how do you do this? What does that mean in real terms? It means that when you've had this awakening experience, you feel compelled to become an educator, or maybe go into public life, into politics, he says, because you will want to change things for people. The problem, Plato says, is that if you've gone out into the daylight, seen things as they really are, seen things that you had been unable to imagine before you experienced and saw them firsthand, how are you going to present that to people in the cave? If you just go back into the cave and say, wait a minute, everybody, A, B, C, D, and E, and all the way to Z, they're not going to be able to process what you're saying. They won't be able to imagine it. They won't be able to believe it, and they will think you are crazy. And so Plato says, what we have to do is go back into the cave and act as if we are one of the people in the cave still in chains, but then just break our information to our peers bit by bit, little by little, here and there, so that gradually they can begin to take on board what it is we've learned and are wanting to share. Now, clearly, Plato is saying that is his own situation. Now, at this point, I should say, of course, Plato writes for Socrates. He claims that his works are there really just to disseminate and explain the teaching of Socrates, teaching that he experienced firsthand as a student of Socrates. But of course, every word in Plato's books is written by Plato. So whether we're reading the words of Socrates or any of the other characters, Timaeus, Critias, Phaedo, Simmias, they are all really the words of Plato. And by having multiple characters speaking in his books, he's able to share ideas, think through the implications of them, attribute things to Socrates, have other people speculate, have other people put other ideas that can then be rebuffed, examined, or reinforced by Socrates. And he tells us right at the beginning of the books, this is what he's doing. There's a degree of fictionalization. He's not saying these are verbatim recollections of real conversations with Socrates. He's saying we're going to have a play with these ideas. In the book of Phaedo, for instance, he describes all the people who were present for this conversation you're about to hear. And he says, only Plato was missing. I think he was unwell that day. So it's a little bit of an in-joke saying, I'm playing here, but let's play with these ideas. And by having multiple characters, he's able to spread out his ideas into what we would call science, logic applied to things we can all observe. He's able to report ancestral narratives, such as received by Solon, the Greek legislator, and passed on to his fellow student Critias. They all heard the stories of Atlantis in that context. He talks about transpersonal experiences as the result of ingesting a psychoactive tea at the Eleusinian sect, the Eleusinian mysteries, the Kukion ceremony. And in including the words of other characters, he brings in the status of world thought, international thought. And because he's got this great array of approaches and voices, Plato is able to scatter the amazing things he's learned. Clearly, he is saying that if he just came out and told us everything he now understands because of his contact experiences, his altered states, his work in science, if he just came out and gave us all his conclusions back to back, A to Z, we wouldn't understand it, we wouldn't be able to process it, we wouldn't be able to imagine it or believe it, we would think he was crazy. And so in that analogy of the cave, he's telling us to look throughout his writings and see what he's peppered in those writings, really far-reaching, stretching ideas that if it bunched them all together in a paragraph, we would say this guy is out of his mind. When you read Plato, and when you're able to digest it and reflect on what he's told us, you could see why he might have given us that warning, that little rider, this might be stretching for you. Because some of the things he talks about are the idea that we are not the first civilization on planet Earth, but that in fact, the planet Earth lives quite a vulnerable life in which every few thousand years there is an extinction level event, which means that civilization has to reboot. It's quite a far-reaching concept, but it's there in his book, in Timaeus and Critias, in the section on Atlantis. He talks about planet Earth not being flat and not being under a firmament. He says that it's a globe suspended in space, and that if we were able to generate enough power and speed, we would be able to get beyond the atmosphere and see into deep space to understand the movements of the stars and planets better. How on earth did he know that? The information is there, and I'm sure it would have left a lot of people reeling at that time. He says the Earth is like one of those 12-sided leather balls, like a soccer ball. It looks like a swirl of white and blue and gold. And that is not how we pictured the planet until 1968, and yet the information is there. He says that we can have contact and lucid conversations with other kinds of entity, trans-dimensional beings whom we experience at and around the point of death. They come to us as guides to help us do what you and I might call a life review and to coach us through what comes next. His belief is that we are primarily beings of consciousness, and that as conscious beings, we pre-exist this material life and then we survive it. And when our material life expires, he says, guides come alongside us and in effect say, so how do you feel that went? And they help us process what has happened. He talks about the importance of how we process what happens in our lives. And he says we will enjoy a better transition and a better what comes next if we are able to move away from heavier emotions, things like rage, unforgiveness, fear, trauma, resentment, unfulfilled ambition, hatred, jealousy. If we can shake those off and live at a higher vibrational level, live out of creativity, love, imagination, curiosity, compassion, it means we'll have a better material experience and a better transition. This is what he puts forward in his books, and he says that he learned that through altered states of consciousness, through the Kukion ceremony at the Eleusinian sect in ancient Athens. He wasn't sure who or what these entities were. He said they might be the spirits of our ancestors, either through our family lines or through our line as a species, and that we might go on after this life to another experience here, or in another region of space, or in another dimension. Pretty far-reaching concepts. He also talked about the company that we enjoy on this planet. And he spoke about there being all kinds of beings, those who live under the water, on the earth, in the air, and in outer space. He talked about the sky people, the people who live on islands in the air, who are longer lived than we are, healthier than we are, more intelligent than we are, who are able to generate the power and speed to get them beyond the atmosphere so that they have a fuller understanding of what space is and how objects in space move and relate to each other. He talked about other kinds of being who were involved in creating the world as we know it. A kind of being called the craftsman or demiurgos. So this is a tremendously powerful kind of being that can do terraforming. And Plato isn't the only person in antiquity to talk about this. You can find the same concept in Native American story, Aboriginal Australian story, Indigenous African story. And I write about these stories in my books, The Scars of Eden and The Invasion of Eden in particular. These are all pretty stretching concepts. And if it bunched them all together, maybe you wouldn't have found a publisher for his book. But of course, Plato has been in print continually for the past 2,500 years. Now, all these ideas were of no great issue to the early Christian writers. Paul knew Plato, the Apostle Paul knew Plato like the back of his hand. And there are about 12 Apostle Paul quotes, which are really Plato quotes, where all Paul has done is change a word or two to give it a spin and allow him to say something new in a way that was really resonant with the people of that time. Plato was quoted as a great authority by church fathers like Origen, who is considered the pioneer of Christian hermeneutics, the principles of interpretation. He is quoted left, right, and center by Clement of Alexandria, the founder of the Alexandrian school of hermeneutics. Now, Clement and Origen both listened to Jesus in the light of Plato. And so when they went to the Gospel of John, and they hear John saying that Jesus was a conscious being before he had this material life, and that he survived it and continued after this material life, they recognize that as the language of Plato. And it's very difficult not to read the prologue of John's Gospel and not hear the echoes of Platonic thought in it. Origen, Clement of Alexandria, Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr said that really, mathematically, Plato is the best preparation people can have for what Jesus was on about. He said the Hebrew stories were the preparation for the Jewish people. But for the rest of the world, well, that would be Plato. And so mathematically, he was conceiving essentially of an Old Testament of Plato and a New Testament of Jesus and the apostolic writings. And when these church fathers looked at the stories curated by the Hebrew canon, they read it in the light of Plato. They read it seeing the actions of the demiurgos in what we call the creation narratives in Genesis 1, but which actually turn out to be terraforming narratives, rehabilitation narratives, recovery narratives regarding the planet after the most recent cataclysm. Remember the series of cataclysms that Plato talked about as being the experience of planet Earth. And so they saw no conflict between what Plato talked about and what Jesus was on about. Plato talked about there being interventions in our development as a species by the gods. And he said the gods came and they fine-tuned us so that we could be more intelligent, more conscious, more capable. And this was the story, he said, of the Greek gods. And then he clarified what he meant by the word gods. He didn't mean some imaginary, supernatural, transcendent entity. He said a god can be one of two things. Either it's the personification of a celestial body, and in reality we're talking about the sun or the moon or the stars or the planets. God can be used that way. Or he said it refers to another kind of being, a flesh and bone being, but that is more advanced than we are. So that was the cosmology of Plato. You put it all together and you think, oh my goodness, how did he get away with publishing such far-reaching concepts? Well, he did it in the way he describes in the cave, by peppering all these elements throughout his writings, throughout all his books, so that we would have to read all his books and then piece it all together. Finding that information, reframing his worldview, he describes as an awakening process in that analogy. And I can compare it to my own experience and to the experience of many whom I have coached in recent years. Since publishing Escaping from Eden, personal coaching and workshops has been a big part of my work. And I have been amazed to find people of every age, from their 20s to their 90s, coming to me and saying, I no longer believe what I did 5 years ago. I have bought out of my old worldview, my old paradigms, and I'm thinking that reality is very different to what I thought it was. And I've got an appetite on me to find out what's real. What's true about our origins as a species? What's true about our place in the cosmos? What is true about our potential as human beings? What is true about our connection with the source of the cosmos and everything in it? What's true about God and what's false about God? And it is as if for generations of people, the scales have fallen from people's eyes. They have emerged from the cave. They are seeing new realities, and many are wanting to become educators to help raise the awareness and intelligence and consciousness of humanity as a whole, hence events like this very summit that we're enjoying right now. People talk to me about awakening experiences that have just happened to them. Sometimes we call these spiritual emergencies or a spiritual emergence. People have experiences where all of a sudden they get a rapid download of new information. And this can happen spontaneously or traumatically. I know people who have suffered accidents, had strokes, been struck by lightning, and all of a sudden they're getting a rapid download of new information that is coherent and that then begins rewriting their worldview. And this was the case for me. I had been preaching through the Bible for 33 years, and then I suffered an ultimate frisbee injury. We play it rough in Australia, and it gave me the opportunity to follow some white rabbits, to follow my curiosity, to go back to anomalies in the Bible or anomalies in the stories we tell from the Bible and approach them as Bible translation questions. And as I went back to the texts and went back to the root meanings of the key words, I realized there was a whole other layer of story hidden in plain sight in the Bible. I realized that many of the Bible stories of beginnings were really the retelling of the ancient stories from out of Sumeria, Babylonia, Arcadia, and Assyria. And I realized that those were stories not of gods, but of sky people. People who came to Earth from the stars in the deep past, colonized our planet, governed over our ancestors, and these stories are unmissable. I realized that the Elohim stories of the Bible are the Hebrew version of the Anunnaki stories of ancient Mesopotamia. And it was these discoveries that led to the publication of Escaping from Eden, The Scars of Eden, Echoes of Eden, The Eden Conspiracy, my latest book, The Invasion of Eden, and To Be Announced. As I followed the white rabbits of these translation anomalies, I went back to Elohim stories that I had thought were God's stories. And I went back to the Yahweh stories that I had thought were God's stories. And reading them using the root meanings, I began to evaluate what was going on. And suddenly I could recognize an invasion for what it was, colonization for what it was. I could recognize an assault on human intelligence for what it was. I could recognize xenophobia for what it was. I could recognize quite ugly behaviors among some of these Elohim for what they were. Whereas in the past, because I'd read them as God stories, I had to excuse all that immorality and call it holy because it was being done by God. And so an important aspect of rediscovering the texts was rediscovering my own conscience. Because nobody can read, for instance, the story of God deciding to destroy everyone in a flood and not think, that's awful. But if you're a devout believer, you have to suppress that thought and say, oh no, God was quite justified in doing that for reasons A, B, C, and D. Now, I put out a number of videos on the Paul Wallis channel talking about incidents like that, moral clues that we're looking at stories that are not about God, and you wouldn't believe the number of people who come into the comments and say, oh no, that's justified because those people weren't devout. Or that's justified because those people weren't genetically pure. And you have all the kind of language that has led to every major slaughter in world history. There's always a reason. There's always a reason to say these people are not really human, therefore it's all right to kill them. And to find that justified by people who consider themselves enlightened is really shocking. But if you read those stories as God stories, you have to read it that way. And so through the ages, being devout has required you to shut down your own conscience, to shut down your own mind to the extent that things that are obvious to a child, you now refuse to see. And so awakening includes a moral awakening, an awakening to your own conscience and to your own thoughts. And every week, every day of every week, I'm contacted by people thanking me for my work because of the way it's affirmed their own mind and their own conscience. I always thought this. I've always seen this. I've always suspected this. I felt this from when I was a child, people will say, and yet they had to keep a lid on all of that. And so really it is, I think, a very psychologically and socially damaging thing that we have done to perpetuate misunderstandings and mistranslations. Our ancestors are trying to tell us what they experienced in the past, how awful it was, and how we might have a better human experience, how in the past we discovered our power, how when we came together and acted together, we found that the great powers no longer had power over us. There are all these really important lessons in the ancient stories the moment we read them with an open eye and listen with a fresh ear. And so I think part of the awakening that we're experiencing is that people are listening again to their own thoughts. They're paying attention again to their own consciences, the response of their own guts, their own bodies to things that they've seen and heard. And we are recovering a sense of our own intelligence and our own consciousness. Now, I want to say a little word about awakening from a religious perspective. Because if you read church history, you will realize that there have been moments in history where there's been real experiences that have been powerful and life-changing that have figured within the religious life of various communities. So I'll give a for instance of the mendicant revolution of the 1200s. Now this was a period following various wars, crusades in particular, when the middle classes of Europe returned, young men returned from the battlefields of the crusades. And their world had been ruined because they now had an understanding of geopolitics that they didn't have before. Ridiculous exchanges of wealth had nothing to do with a holy war, had nothing to do with a capture of the holy city, had nothing to do with fighting under the banner of Jesus. And they began to understand the world as it really works. And when they went home to Europe, they dropped out of mainstream society because even as merchants and sons of merchants, they no longer saw themselves as stakeholders in a world controlled by the 1%. They dropped out, they lived in poverty, they lived as beggars, And these were the revolutionary movements headed by people like Francis of Assisi. The Cathars could be seen in this context as well. Dominic, who was the bridge between those two, sought to fashion a facsimile of what the Cathars were doing within the realm of Orthodox Catholicism. But there was an experience that these people were having that made living in poverty more than bearable, that made it joyful for them. They were known as the happy people. The Franciscans were the happy people, the Cathars were the good people. And history has told those stories through a religious lens. So we're told the story of Cathars as a story of heretics who were all gotten rid of. And if you read the history books, it says they petered out. In fact, they were the result of a campaign that lasted 100 years, that killed up to 1 million people under 19 successive popes, because they found what the Cathars were doing so threatening. They found a different way with the Franciscans when St. Francis went to Rome to petition the Pope. It wasn't because he wanted to be counted a good Catholic. It was him saying, can all the good Catholics leave us alone and stop burning down our churches? And the Pope of the day, Pope Innocent, said, yes, okay, we will categorize you as penitents, which means people who are doing extreme things because they're seeking to get right with God. And that was the Pope's way of saying, leave the Franciscans alone. But there was an experience of unity with creation that the Franciscans were describing. And there was an experience of unity with a higher version of themselves, such as the Cathars were describing, something else Plato talked about in his book, by the way. And when you read of other revival movements through history, again, the churches tell these stories as a revival of orthodoxy, a revival of Christianity. But when you go to what people were actually experiencing, what was actually happening, and you'll realize that what people were experiencing was overwhelming experiences of love and light and heat and a feeling of an expansion of their minds, an expansion of their knowledge. And though the church said, oh, this is great, this is a revival of religion, very often in the moment, that's not how it was responded to. So in the Welsh revival, for instance, there was a revival in 1859 and in 1904. And what people were experiencing was complete freedom from fear and a total infusion of love and joy. People were thrown out of the churches for that because they were no longer bound by the fear of hell. And if they weren't bound by the fear of hell, then they weren't bound by the political powers of the church either. They couldn't be manipulated. They couldn't be bossed around. They didn't need to do anything, in fact, because they had this assurance, was the word that they used. And so I think it's a very interesting history, the history of religion. There have been moments when, for whatever reason, spontaneously, hundreds and thousands of people start having these life-enhancing, mind-expanding experiences. And I think we're going through a time rather similar right now. Certainly judging by my inbox, it's people from every nation, people of every generation who are having these awakening experiences. I think in recent years, this mass awakening has been turbocharged through YouTube and Google. And in particular, at the time of the lockdowns, people had the opportunity to pursue their curiosity in a way that a couple of generations ago they couldn't. It would be a highly motivated person who would go to the library and start following their curiosity into a full-blown spiritual emergence or awakening experience, but when it only takes a few clicks. And I've heard from so many people in the coaching space who said that's exactly what happened to them, that they'd always had these questions and this curiosity. The lockdowns gave them the opportunity to pursue that, and now their whole worldview has changed. Their understanding of human origins, human potential, our place in the cosmos. And I think we have the potential of entering a new renaissance. Now, one of the things that really turbocharged the Renaissance was the advent of printing, because it meant that new science could be distributed way beyond the academic community, and that people all around the world could be introduced to new science, new understandings. New generations of people could rediscover Plato. So Marsilio Ficino translated the works of Plato into Latin and the Corpus Hermeticum into Latin, so that all of a sudden, anyone who could read throughout Europe was exposed to ancient information of the kind I describe in my books. So people's whole worldview was shifting. The churches were very nervous about this, because these ancient stories might very well liberate people from enslavement to Orthodox Christianity, the fear of hell, and being under the power of church authorities. And so they viewed people like Marsilio Ficino with great suspicion. But the information could spread through the advent of printing, so much so that somebody like Giordano Bruno could tour Europe and gather massive crowds of people who wanted to learn how to use their brains differently. And he used to hold lectures on how to use your brain differently and expand your memory so that you can hold more knowledge and then begin to change in the light of that knowledge. This was really a big part of what people went to see him for, but they were also interested in his cosmology, because he talked about a populated cosmos. A cosmos with billions of stars, with habitable zones and populated planets, with beings similar to us, many of whom may be even more advanced, he said. Unfortunately, we know that his story ended very unhappily. On Ash Wednesday, 1600, when the Roman Catholic Church burned him to death in a public square in Rome as a signal to the reading public not to read any more Giordano Bruno. But the information was out there. And because there were people gathering libraries around the world, because reading was absolutely taking off around the world, there was an information revolution that we could liken to what's happening right now. There has been a great democratization of access to information. I want to finish by talking about our obligations to one another, because I think the precursor to my own awakening experience that led to my books, the Eden series, that led to the fifth kind, was after my injury, I had a pause between jobs, and I made it a priority to get my health back to 100%, my emotional health, my mental health, my sense of peace and well-being. And so I prioritized things like getting sunlight on my skin, doing deep breathing, barefoot walking, going for walks in the Australian bush. It was a wonderful time of R&R for me. And I remember going on a walk one day, and some of you will have heard this story before, where I was met by a number of animals who were normally very, very shy. So first an echidna came up to my feet and just looked at me, and we shared a long moment of several minutes together. And then it was a mountain pygmy possum, did exactly the same. And then it was two swamp wallabies who usually hop away from you if you're walking through the Australian bush. These two hopped up to me and just watched me. And then it was a 5-foot-long goanna. And when I had that experience, I thought, well, this is a good sign, because I must have been able to get my peace back to an extent that I could walk through a forest and be an undisturbing presence for the animals in the forest. Now I look back and I think something deeper was happening. There was some kind of an activation happening in that moment. And I think if we are to make fresh discoveries, think new thoughts, if we're able to reframe our own worldviews, it's only if we can have that spirit of peace and playfulness. People can't do that if they are under the pump. And I think if we want to help people in the cave, people among our own family, among our friendship groups, I think the first step is not to go and give them lectures, but to help take the pressure of those around us. If you can gift somebody a holiday, if you can gift somebody some money, if you can gift something that is for that person's pleasure and leisure, that's more important than giving them new information, because until they're in a place where they are less stressed and healthier and more relaxed, they cannot do the awakening process, certainly in the way that I enjoyed. And I think we need to help each other not only survive in the very demanding conditions that many of us are living our lives, we have to help each other thrive and enjoy life, because it's in that state of mind that I think we're able to think new thoughts, learn new things, and make new journeys. I think we're under the pump in a couple of ways. Firstly, financially. Most of us are having to work too hard and we're overscheduled simply trying to make ends meet. And it's difficult to awaken while that's going on. But also I think algorithms on YouTube and Google can be quite unhelpful because they pitch us against each other. They pitch us into arguments with total strangers. And I think we've got to say no to that kind of polarization in every way possible. I have a lot of practice at this on a daily basis. I get so many people coming to me with aggro and aggressively attacking me. I get a lot of practice in trying not to respond in like and trying to have a conversation. And I'm actually very encouraged that when we engage in a friendly, thoughtful, listening manner, conversations are still possible. And I think we need to make a decision together not to be polarized or tribalized, but to be as compassionate as we can towards others, to help encourage their curiosity when people are curious, and affirm people's questions when they have questions, so that we can talk together, because then we can discern together. Events like this are tremendously important because we are thinking together. With all the presenters that you've heard over the last few days, we don't all agree on everything, but we're all here because we're willing to listen to each other and consider each other's ideas, review each other's material, and learn together in such a way that our world might change. And I think if we can spread the idea that exploration of this life can be a wonderful and joyful thing, then we will lift our collective mood. We will lift our collective emotional state and get us to a point where together we can walk out of that cave and see new possibilities, understand new realities, and say, this is a world I want to live in. This is a world I want to explore. So thank you so much for listening to me today. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there live and in person, but I'm very thankful, Neil, that you've included me to be part of the lineup. Wish you every success with the sharing of this conference, and I will look forward to seeing you, Neil, and everyone at the next summit. Health and peace.